In June 1816, farmers across parts of New England walked into fields turned white overnight. Not with morning dew, with frost. Corn planted only weeks earlier had blackened in the cold, its leaves curled and dead, as though a winter night had wandered into summer and refused to leave. They were not the only ones to see it. Snow fell that same week in parts of New England, in a month when the fields should already have been turning green. Across the Atlantic, in Britain and France, cold rain fell for days without stopping, drowning crops that had already survived one hard winter and were now failing to survive. The summer meant to save them. The crops had survived the winter. They would not survive the summer. Nobody standing in those ruined fields understood why. There was no storm to blame, no single event they had witnessed. Just a season that refused to behave like a season. The answer had already been decided more than a year earlier. On a mountain most of them had never heard of. On an island most of them could not have found on a map. The island of Sumbawa sits in what is now Indonesia. In April 1815, the mountain at its center, Tambora, tore itself apart. It was one of the most powerful eruptions in recorded history. The sound of it was heard over 1,000 miles away, mistaken by some who heard it for distant cannon fire. Ash fell so thickly that in nearby regions, day turned briefly into night. Entire communities near the mountain were destroyed within hours, buried under flows of scalding ash and rock that moved faster than anyone could outrun. Farmland that had fed thousands of families vanished under grey ash, some of it still falling days later. What followed was not just destruction, it was starvation. Crops failed across the region in the eruption's immediate aftermath, and disease spread through communities already weakened by hunger and displacement. Historians still do not agree on exactly how many people died on Sumbawa and the surrounding islands, from the eruption itself, and from the famine and disease that followed it. Estimates run into the tens of thousands. The uncertainty itself is part of the story. An enormous human loss, still not fully counted. This was not a warning sign for the rest of the world. For the people of Sumbawa, it was already the disaster. What almost no one yet understood was that the mountain was not finished. Most of what Tambora threw into the sky fell back down close to the volcano, but sulfur-rich gases rose far above ordinary clouds and formed a thin veil of particles across the upper atmosphere. That veil reflected a small amount of sunlight away from Earth. The change was slight, but crops depended on months of steady warmth. Across an entire growing season, even a small disruption could damage a harvest. The eruption no longer needed to be visible. It had changed the sky itself. And a changed sky does not announce itself. It simply arrives, months later, as a season that will not warm. By the summer of 1816, the disruption reached far beyond Indonesia. In New England, farmers recorded frost in June and again in July and August, in some places, hard enough to kill crops that had only just begun to recover from the last freeze. Snow fell on hillsides that should have been thick with summer grass. In Britain, the trouble came less as frost and more as relentless cold rain. Fields turned to mud. Grain that should have been ripening in the sun instead sat waterlogged, refusing to fill out, refusing to ripen at all in some regions. In parts of continental Europe, similar patterns emerged, a growing season that simply would not commit to warmth. Not every place suffered equally. Some regions lost only weeks of good growing weather. Others lost most of a season. The damage was real, but it was not identical everywhere, and it did not look the same twice. What connected these separate, uneven hardships was something farmers in 1816 could not see. Livestock feed, grown from the same failing fields, began to run short as well. Animals that depended on hay and grain through the winter now faced a summer that had not grown enough for them to survive on. A season had failed quietly, in 100 different fields, in 100 different ways. failed crops do not stay in the fields. They travel into markets, into bakeries, into the price of bread. As harvests came in smaller and later across 1816, grain grew scarce and its price rose. In parts of Europe already strained by years of war and economic disruption, bread, the most basic food many families relied on, became harder to afford. Poorer families felt it first and worst. Livestock, already weakened by the shortage of feed, were sold early or simply did not survive. Meals shrank. In some regions, the shortage and its prices sparked open unrest, disputes, and food riots, as people who could see grain in the markets found they could no longer afford enough of it. The weather did not create inequality. It revealed who had the least protection from it, because that was the cruelty of it. This was rarely a story of no food existing at all. It was a story of food existing just out of reach for the people who needed it most. For some families, a single failed season was survivable. For others, it was the final push toward a decision already forming. In New England, families who had struggled through the failed harvest packed what they owned and moved west, searching for land that might prove more forgiving. In parts of Europe, communities already weighed down by war debts and hard years found the added strain of 1816 enough to set them moving toward cities, toward ports, toward the hope of somewhere else. The mountain in Indonesia did not cause every migration of the era. Poverty, war, and years of accumulated hardship were already pushing people to move before 1816 arrived. But for many families standing at the edge of that decision, a season with no harvest was what finally tipped them over it. A single failed summer could not be undone. For some, neither could the choice it forced. For the people living through it, 1816 offered no explanation. No news of a mountain on the other side of the world had reached most farming communities, and even if it had, no one yet understood that a distant eruption could touch their own weather, so people reached for the explanations available to them. Some saw it as divine punishment, a judgment on their communities. Others blamed sunspots, or simply unusual local weather, the kind that occasionally visits any region without lasting meaning. Rumors spread, as they do whenever an entire population is frightened by something none of them can name. None of this made these people foolish. They were reasoning carefully, with the knowledge available to them, in a world where news traveled by ship and season, not by instrument or signal. The idea that a mountain thousands of miles away could reach into their fields would have sounded to them like superstition itself. The truth was stranger than any of their explanations, but it was also, at the time, simply unreachable. That same cold, wet summer settled over another group entirely. A small circle of writers gathered near Lake Geneva, including Mary Godwin, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron. Trapped indoors by days of persistent rain that would not break, the group grew restless. Byron proposed a challenge, that each of them write a ghost story to pass the ruined season. Out of those confined, storm-bound evenings came one of the most enduring works in English literature, the beginnings of what would become Frankenstein, taking shape in Mary's mind by candlelight. Byron, in that same unsettled summer, wrote the poem Darkness, imagining a world without a sun. The failed summer did not write these works, but it shaped the room they were written in. Long hours indoors, a sky that would not clear, and nothing to do but imagine something darker than the weather outside. The volcanic haze did not last forever. Over the following years, its effect on the sky gradually weakened, and growing seasons slowly returned to something closer to normal, though recovery did not arrive everywhere at once, or evenly. But a season is easier to repair than a life. The debts taken on during the shortage did not vanish with the return of good weather. The families who had left their homes in search of land or work did not simply turn around. The hunger, the unrest, and the disruption of 1816 left marks that outlasted the cold itself. The atmosphere recovered faster than the people whose lives it had disrupted. it would take more than a century to fully connect 1816 to Tambora. The proof came not from any single document, but from fragments scattered across the world. Layers of ancient ice, drilled from glaciers, held a thin trace of sulfur dated to the right year. Tree rings from that same year, taken from forests thousands of miles from Indonesia, were narrower than the rings beside them, a quiet record of a season that had not grown properly. Weather diaries kept by ordinary people described frost in June and rain that would not stop. Grain price ledgers recorded the exact months bread became unaffordable. And on Sumbawa itself, layers of ash and rock still marked how far the eruption's destruction had reached. Ice had kept its own record. So had the trees. So had the ledgers no one thought would matter. Only by placing all of it side by side could anyone finally see the full shape of what had happened. A single story, told in fragments from opposite sides of the world. Tambora erupted for days. Its consequences traveled for years. Families thousands of miles away lost crops, animals, and in some cases their homes, without ever hearing the mountain's name or understanding what had reached them. It was only much later that evidence buried in ice, wood, and paper allowed anyone to trace the connection back to its source. In 1816, summer did not vanish everywhere. But in the places where it failed, something set in motion on a distant island had reached across an ocean and quietly rewritten a year of ordinary lives. A mountain across the world had changed their summer. Most never knew its name.